Hi folks, my name is Brady and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be checking out more from MapMen, which is always fun. Today's subject is how many continents are there, which is an interesting conversation, one that we've taken on before on this channel. You may have been taught about continents in one way, you may have been taught it multiple ways. It really depends on who's the teacher and what they're trying to convey. Continents, in a lot of ways, aren't real. I mean, I guess from a scientific perspective, if you break them down by like tectonic plates or whatever, that's a very, very real, tangible thing. But most of the time when we're talking about continents, we're talking about something that's just dripping in shared culture from country to country, and a lot of stuff that, if you're just breaking it down by the large land masses, may not make the most sense. So this is always a fun conversation to have, and I feel like I'm getting a little better at articulating my points on this the more times I get the opportunity to talk about it. So it's always fun to return to similar subjects, and it's MapMen. There's no doubt that they're going to be one of the more interesting takes, so this should be cool.
When you look at the world map, it's immediately obvious how many continents there are and which countries belong to which ones.
No, it isn't.
That's right. That's why we're doing an episode about it. Welcome to We're the Men, and here's the map.
I've done this subject, and I've gone over like, yeah, this can be done different ways, and then like there's always somebody who's just like, nope, there's five. Nope, there's absolutely five. You can't convince me otherwise, or whatever. But I think it's best to really acknowledge up front how layered this is as a conversation, how very political it can be, and kind of understand why other people might classify it differently from how you maybe used to be classifying things. We'll talk about the Australian issue as the video goes on.
All British primary schools rated at least satisfactory by Ofsted will teach their children that there are 7 continents: Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, North America, and South America.
But other countries
That's interesting.
beg to differ. In parts of Europe, they teach just 6 continents.
In Russia and Japan, they teach a different 6 continents.
And in South America, they teach just 5 continents.
So who should we believe?
Whom should we believe?
Exactly.
The most common definition of a continent is a large continuous landmass separated by oceans.
I like that definition. It's exactly how I imagine a continent.
That's not real.
Now take a look at a world map and tell me how many large continuous landmasses are separated by ocean.
Great. Australia?
1.
North America?
Yeah.
It's attached to South America.
But the Panama Canal
Is man-made and definitely not an ocean.
Point. So all of America.
I kind of understand that part. Making America one big continent. It's always the question of like, how useful is this information as opposed to using things like countries? Because the reason we have continents in a lot of ways is to group much more stuff together. That's why Australia being a continent is something that I don't really use as much. I classify it as like the larger oceanic countries, which kind of are all the nations that are like not really part of one continuous landmass, because like we already have it as a classification as like its own country. It's not really useful to have it be classified as a continent as well. It doesn't do anything for us that having it classified as a country doesn't do, you know? If there was something fundamentally different about the continent of Australia versus the country of Australia, I would find it a little bit more useful. I understand one is a political entity and one is a physical entity, but if we can accomplish the same thing by just referring to it as a country, I don't see the point of having it being classified as a continent. It's just like, how useful can it be? So that's why I go with like the oceanic version of it. Like, hey, it's kind of like the other category, but it's one of the larger things in the other category.
2.
Antarctica?
3.
Africa?
Antarctica's weird.
Separated from Eurasia by another man-made canal, the Suez, so it doesn't fit the definition.
I see. So Afro-Eurasia.
Congratulations!
So according to the most common definition, there should only be 4 continents.
Also, the largest of these, Afro-Eurasia, contains 86% of the world's population, making it a useless distinction.
I don't like this definition anymore.
That's what I'm saying.
So can we instead use another, more sciencey definition?
We can. The reason the Earth's
Like tectonics.
are spread out as they are is because the tectonic plates that make up the Earth's crust have moved them apart.
I love talking about this, though I'm not very scientifically minded, so I don't really use this all that much. But I always like to leave the distinction whenever because I always say, like, continents aren't real. Except if you're talking about this. That's always the distinction I have to make, because somebody's going to be a smarty pants and try to point that out.
Over time, and using the major tectonic plates as our guide to the continents, we get a more even distribution of where they are.
Tectonically speaking, North America is separate from South America, Africa is separate from Eurasia, and Antarctica and Australia are separate from everything. Nice and simple.
But on closer inspection,
There's a couple...
definition also has some major issues.
For example, Australia. The country of Australia is this bit.
But the tectonic plate, also called Australia, includes Australia and a bit of New Zealand, and half of the island of Papua, which includes both Papua New Guinea and the province of Papua, which is in Indonesia, which is in Asia.
Which is confusing.
So this is useful to somebody, but not to those who are interested in the social and political elements, which often people in social studies will be. However, you can kind of mix disciplines depending on what you're talking about, and you can maybe find a use for this in a social study. But overall, like, to somebody like me, this definition would not have any use. But to somebody like you, maybe this is what makes the most sense.
Confusing. So, to avoid this country-continent muddle, other names for this continent do exist, including Sahul, Meganesia, and Australinia.
Not to be confused with Australasia, an increasingly unfashionable term describing Australia and New Zealand and some but not all of the Pacific Islands, so we're not going to mention it again.
So then, what continent does New Zealand belong to? By both
I've not heard that one.
So
That's
far,
interesting.
none.
Good for New Zealand. What's wrong with not belonging to any continent?
Not being able to take part in the Olympics. Because this famous 4-yearly competition to see who can host the best fireworks display is open to every country in the world, its 5 continental rings must somehow include them all.
Each ring represents a different continent. There's Europe, America, Africa, Asia.
And this one represents a broad region including Australia, New Zealand, as well as the Micro, Mela, and Polynesian countries known as Oceania.
Oceania, yeah. That's what I use. I know it may not be perfect, and Australians don't seem to be as fond of it, because mostly, I'd imagine, because they get top billing in the Australia is a continent version. But I think Oceania actually is very useful, because there's so many different countries that this can fit. I understand Australia is huge, and it's weird to just treat it like it's just another island. A really massive island, but just another island. And that may be a little bit reductive, but I think it's more useful than just having it be a continent in itself. And especially if it's absorbing other nations into that, like, continental identity, which is kind of like erasing a lot of these smaller places.
Very name meaning the opposite of continent, is not considered one by any strict definition, but it's a popular term, especially for the purpose of making sure no country misses out on being incontinent. Only Antarctica doesn't get an Olympic ring because it's too cold to host a fireworks display.
Like, not many people live there.
Olympic approaches could be easily combined, including both Antarctica and Oceania, giving us a nice problem-free
We've talked about
6
Antarctica.
continents.
Except it's not problem-free at all. We need to talk about Europe.
Whether part of a landmass or
a
plate, Europe appears to be nothing more than a glorified Asian peninsula. So, what actually is Europe?
Can it really be possible that the home of the continental breakfast isn't even a continent at all? And if so, what do we call that breakfast other than disappointing?
Which brings us to a third element to consider in the definition of a continent: culture. Knowing which continent a country's in immediately tells you something about what it's like.
And because Norway has more in common with Sweden when it comes to language, religion, ethnicity and favourite cutlery than it does with, say, Vietnam, a line is helpfully drawn here, breaking Eurasia up into 2 bits. But complicated culture can't be conveniently cut into clear categories.
Some countries cause tremendous headaches for this dividing line.
First, Armenia, a country which, with a 95%...
I believe with some people, depending on how you teach it, like, I think Greenland, while it would make sense to fit it as part of North America, I think a lot of people teach it as if it's part of Europe, which seems weird, like, space-wise, but culture-wise it would make sense. Iceland is kind of like this in-between thing where it might be able to, like, fit into North America, like, region-wise. I don't know. It's kind of in the middle. But it's definitely, culturally, far more European. So there's a lot of amazing examples like that.
Christian population arguably falls in the
They might go into that, so maybe I jumped the gun there.
Asia. And speaking as someone who's a 32nd Armenian, where do you think these eyebrows come from? I can confirm I have no idea what continent it should be in.
The second problem country is Turkey, which incessantly prides itself on being an
Asian-European hybrid. Food?
Asia.
Trading partners?
Europe.
Religion?
Asia.
Writing system?
Europe.
This leaves the dividing line with no option but to split Turkey's largest city, Istanbul, straight down the middle, misleading.
It's a blurry line.
Nations either side of the Straits of Bosphorus are somehow totally different from one another.
One way of solving the problem of where the line goes is to insist that it doesn't exist.
Which is the approach taken by Russia, which should come as no surprise.
Russia's interesting.
To view Eurasia as a single continent.
I've seen some people try to argue that Russia itself should be considered a continent, and I have kind of the issue there where it's not very useful. It's kind of like the Australia thing. It's not very useful to consider Russia a continent, but there is something unique in Russia's culture that just makes it hard to perfectly classify. It seems like it's European, but it's a little off of a lot of European nations. It's not quite the same.
It's divided. That might make people think they're different from each other.
And when people think they're different, they like to talk about things like independence.
Ooh. Messier, some European countries have significant territories in other continents. The largest part of Denmark is officially in North America.
And France, with dozens of overseas territories, has put bits of Europe in Africa, Oceania, both Americas and Antarctica.
Perhaps the best
complicated.
Example of the difficulty of pinning down what is and isn't Europe can be found in the insufferable Eurovision Song Contest.
Insufferably fabulous?
In its first year, just 7 very European countries took to the stage. Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Switzerland and West Germany.
But with more countries wanting to get in on the pop-tastic action, this quickly expanded, adding transcontinental Russia, dubiously European Georgia, Asia's Israel, Africa's Morocco, eventually giving up the geographical facade altogether with Australia's Australia.
Yeah.
What Eurovision demonstrates quite well is that continents are all about politics.
Every continent now has some form of political and economic union. There's Mercosur, the African Union, ASEAN, and of course the EU.
But these organisations are rarely drawn on the same lines as the continents themselves. Despite the number of people who confused Britain leaving the EU with Britain leaving Europe, it remains something which, tectonically speaking, we can't actually have a referendum on. The underlying question in all of this is, why does it matter how many continents there are? Should we even care which one we belong to?
Well, continents in itself, like, before they get into their conclusion, there is something useful about being able to, like, generalize a region, but there's also something kind of like a problem with generalizing a region too much, which I think a lot of us have been guilty of. Me included. I'm not writing myself off on this one. I've generalized different regions because I only have so much knowledge of them, and it actually often comes from a failure to be more specific, but also it can be useful to find commonalities between these places. So you win some, you lose some. Being general is very useful in a lot of ways. Being specific isn't always practical in a lot of ways. It really just depends on what point you're trying to make, I suppose.
No, not really. What the continents really represent is a human desire to use broad generalizations to categorize the world into arbitrary subdivisions.
So whether it's 7, 5, or even 6 continents, these subdivisions will remain as useful as they are argued about.
Are you really a 32nd Armenian?
Yes.
Because I'm a 23rd Hawaiian.
Are you really?
No.
Hello.
Bonjour.
Okay, I'm absolutely watching this because they have the best ad breaks I've ever seen, so we're doing this.
With travel restrictions coming to an end, we'll soon be allowed to go on holiday again.
Les restrictions pour voyager sont bientôt terminées. Nous allons pouvoir enfin partir en vacances.
We're doing a Duolingo thing.
To brush up on a foreign language.
Marc ne parle pas français, alors je peux dire ce que je veux.
Which is why we've partnered up with Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone, gotcha.
Anywhere, anytime, on desktop, mobile, or tablet.
Marc ne met pas assez d'assaisonnement dans sa bolognaise.
Instead of dull translation exercise,
I think his French is good.
The approach is to fully immerse you in the
It's hard to tell,
connecting images to words and sounds like.
but I think he's good.
Marc porte les mêmes chaussettes depuis 3 jours.
This makes learning a new language easy and fun, and ultimately gets you thinking in your new language.
J'ai volé tellement de charpie à Marc au cours des 5 dernières années.
and only Rosetta Stone has speech recognition software giving instant feedback on your pronunciation to help perfect your accent and sound like a local.
The best way to enjoy Rosetta Stone is with Rosetta Stone Lifetime Unlimited. Full never-ending access to the current app in as many languages as you like, with phrase books, stories, and text at
Took me a second to realize he was speaking English
your
there.
life.
Click the link in the description below where MapMen viewers get a very special offer on all of Rosetta Stone's subscriptions. Best of all, the
I wanna
Lifetime
learn another
Unlimited offer
language,
for just
but-
£179 for an entire lifetime of immersing yourself in the languages you want to be great at.
A whole lifetime?
En nouvelles compétences linguistiques pour en mettre plein la vue à vos amis.
Entonces,
That's kind of an insane
enlace en la descripción
option.
para comenzar su viaje de aprendizaje de un nuevo idioma.
No hay ningún momento como la presente.
Du hast nichts zu verlieren.
Genau.
Okay, that was a strange end to a pretty fantastic video on a relatively simple subject. You could say it's simple. I guess we can argue about it all day, so maybe it's not simple. Yeah, the way I break down the continents in a way that I think is useful. I mean, I feel like North and South America are so very different that it's important to distinguish them. Like, to link all of America together doesn't always make a whole lot of sense. But sometimes I do like to speak, like, across the two continents, and like sometimes I'll use America in general as kind of a catch-all term for the two continents. So I don't know. So I guess I can go whatever way on that. It just depends on what I'm trying to communicate. There's no point in merging Europe and Asia, because like you can't really speak about them in a general sense when trying to describe something like together about them. I opt for Oceania because I do think it is more inclusive than Australia being a continent, and just generally I find more use out of that. And Africa seems pretty uncontroversial to me. It's interesting. Like, Africa is one of the few places where, like, I don't see a whole lot of argument there. People are like, yeah, Africa makes sense. Like, they made the point about, like, the connection there where it could be, like, Afro-Eurasia or whatever. But most people I've spoken to, like, there don't seem to be any real complaints about Africa, unless you're in favor of the Afro-Eurasia qualification, like, which is fine if you find some use in using that. And the term exists. You're still able to use the term Afro-Eurasia if you find a useful way of saying that. But I personally don't find that term to be all that useful, because it's just too big. It describes too much. So there's not a whole lot of opportunity to use that term efficiently. I'd rather break down those continents a little bit further, but not too much to the point where there's no point in lumping countries together, where we already have things like country names to describe these entities. And like I say throughout the video, I understand the difference between political entities and physical land. I understand that there is a difference there, but I do think I'd like to leave a lot of the stuff like the plate tectonics and whatever. I'd like to leave that to the scientifically minded people. I don't really have use for that either. So that's another reason why I qualify things the way that I do. It's all very social and very cultural to me. But I entertain any breakdown of the continents, because there's really no right way of doing it, as long as you can find an effective use of it. And I know that's one of those things where we don't have a perfect, clear-cut answer. There is always something unsatisfying about that, and I kind of get that. But I also think that sometimes we have to get a little bit more used to having these sort of unsatisfying answers, because it keeps things open. It lets us use our minds and really work within less like constricted parameters, so that's important as well. There's so much that could be talked about with this, but I think I've rambled your ear off enough. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope to be back with another video very soon. All right, I'll see you next time. All right.